Where did you get that ink, old man? The voice cut through the salt air like a blade, sharp and certain and dripping with contempt. Surplus store. Internet. Some buddy who spent 6 months in the reserves and thinks he knows what a trident looks like. Elias Whitfield did not turn around immediately. He had been standing at the chain-link fence for nearly an hour, fingers hooked through the metal diamonds, watching the gray hulls of destroyers and cruisers lined up along the piers of Naval Station Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, home to carriers and submarines and thousands of sailors who walked these grounds with purpose while he stood outside, looking in like a ghost visiting the life he used to live. He turned slowly, economy of movement that came from decades of training he could not unlearn even if he tried. His eyes found a speaker without searching. Master at Arms First Class, the rank insignia clean and proud on the young man's uniform. 28 years old, maybe, strong jaw, certain eyes, the look of someone who had never doubted himself for a single moment of his entire life. The MA was staring at his forearm, at the faded ink barely visible beneath the grime and sun damage. A trident, wings spread, anchor beneath, the mark of a Navy SEAL worn into skin that had aged and weathered until the symbol looked more like a scar than a tattoo. With respect, Petty Officer, Elias said, his voice hoarse from days without conversation, I would rather not discuss it. The young man's face hardened. His hand moved to the radio on his belt. You would rather not discuss it. That is interesting, because I would very much like to discuss how a homeless man ends up with seal ink on his arm. You know what we call that? Stolen valor. Federal offense. Elias said nothing. He had learned years ago that silence was sometimes the only dignity a man had left. The MA stepped closer. His name tag read Kirkpatrick. His eyes held the righteous fire of someone defending something sacred. And Elias understood. He did. The teams meant something. The trident meant something. And there were men out there, frauds and liars, who wore symbols they had not earned because they craved the respect without the sacrifice. But Elias was not one of them. Kirkpatrick grabbed his arm, twisted it toward the morning light to get a better look at the tattoo. The grip was strong, professional, the hold of someone trained in restraint techniques. Elias did not resist. Had not resisted anything in 3 years. Not since the cancer took Elena. Not since the bills took the house. Not since he decided that a man who had let his best friend die in his arms did not deserve comfort or help or a warm bed. This is detailed work, Kirkpatrick said, studying the faded ink. Too detailed for some internet printout. Where did you really get it? Bud/S Class 142, Elias said quietly. Coronado, 1982. Kirkpatrick laughed. A short, sharp sound of pure disbelief. 1982, right? So you would be, what, in your 60s? And I'm supposed to believe you were some kind of special operator. I was, Elias said. I'm not asking you to believe anything. I was just standing here, looking at the ships, remembering. Kirkpatrick's voice dripped with mockery. Let me tell you what I think you are remembering. I think you are remembering some story you read online, some documentary you watched. I think you memorized enough details to sound convincing when you panhandle outside veterans organizations. I've seen you type before, 3 times this year alone. Old men with invented wars playing dress-up for sympathy. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you are from. Drop a comment below with your city or country. You might have a quiet hero in your own community whose humble appearance hides extraordinary service. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and hidden warriors speak to you, please consider subscribing. Now let us continue. Kirkpatrick had already called for backup. 2 more MAs arrived within minutes. A man and a woman, both young, both looking at Elias with the same mixture of suspicion and contempt. He stood there in his layers of worn clothing, boots held together with duct tape, 3 weeks of gray beard covering a face that had once commanded respect in rooms full of admirals. Hand behind your back, the female MA said. You are being detained for suspected violation of federal stolen valor statutes. Elias complied. The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound he had not heard directed at himself in all his 61 years. He had put cuffs on others, enemies of the nation, terrorists, Men who would have killed thousands if he had not stopped them. Now he was the one in restraints, arrested for the crime of being who he was. They walked him toward the security building. Sailors passing by glanced and looked away, embarrassed by the sight of the disheveled old man being escorted in shame. None of them knew. None of them could possibly know, and Elias did not blame them for their ignorance. But what Kirkpatrick did not know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 4 hours a 3-star admiral would speak 6 words that would change everything. And the man they were arresting had bled for that trident in ways they could not imagine. The processing was efficient and impersonal. Fingerprints pressed into digital scanners. Photographs taken against a height chart. Name recorded by a booking officer who typed without looking up. Elias Cormac Whitfield. The name meant nothing to her. Why would it? The operations he had run did not exist in any database she could access. The men he had saved were scattered across the country, living lives made possible by missions that officially never happened. They put him in a holding cell. Concrete bench. Fluorescent light humming overhead. The smell of disinfectant failing to mask older, sadder smells beneath. Elias sat, placed his hands on his knees, straightened his spine the way he had been taught 40 years ago in a different life. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against the layers of fabric to feel the dog tags hidden beneath. Not just his own, Ronnie's tags too. The ones Marie had given him at the funeral with tears streaming down her face. He whispered words too quiet for anyone to hear. Words he spoke every day to a man who had been dead for over 2 decades. Still here, brother. Still trying. The fluorescent light flickered once and then steadied. Somewhere beyond the walls, the ships continued their eternal vigil. And Elias Whitfield, callsign Spectre, waited for whatever came next with the patience of a man who had learned that the only thing he could control was how he faced the things he could not. The concrete bench was cold beneath him, but Elias barely noticed. His body had long ago stopped registering discomfort as anything more than background noise. What occupied his mind now were the memories, rising unbidden like tide water through cracks in a seawall he had spent years trying to maintain. Coronado, 1982. He had been 18 years old when he stepped off the bus at the Naval Special Warfare Center, a skinny kid from a Louisiana fishing village who had never seen the Pacific Ocean. His father worked the boats until his back gave out, came home smelling of salt and diesel, hands calloused into permanent claws. There was no money for college. No future waiting in the bayou except the slow grind of poverty. The Navy recruiter had promised him something else. A chance to become something extraordinary. Bud/S Class 142 started with 173 candidates. 26 graduated. Elias remembered Hell Week like it happened yesterday. The hypothermia, the hallucinations, the instructors screaming that quitting was the easiest thing in the world. Just ring the bell and the pain stops. Ring the bell and you can sleep. Ring the bell and be ordinary again. Men dropped around him like leaves in autumn. Strong men, smart men, men who looked the part far better than the skinny Louisiana kid with nothing to his name but stubbornness. His swim buddy got him through. Ronnie Thibodeau, 2 years older, from the same parish, the one who had talked Elias into enlisting in the first place. They made a pact on the beach during surf torture, teeth chattering so hard they could barely form words. Neither of us quits unless the other does. That was the deal. That was the anchor. Neither of them quit. The memories shifted. 26 years of service compressed into flashes of sensation. The weight of water during underwater noddying, lungs burning, vision narrowing. The silence before a breach, heartbeat loud in his ears, finger resting on the trigger guard. The specific sound a suppressed rifle makes, more mechanical click than explosion. The way time stretches during a firefight until seconds become hours and hours become seconds. He rose through the ranks because he could not do otherwise. Not out of ambition, but out of competence that refused to stay hidden. SEAL Team 4. Then the call to try out for something even more selective. Development Group. The unit that officially did not exist, doing work that officially never happened in places the government would never admit sending them. Operation Crimson Undertow. February 24th, 1991. The Persian Gulf War was in its final days, but someone had neglected to inform the Iraqi unit holding 14 coalition prisoners in a compound west of Kuwait City. The POWs had been captured during a border incursion weeks earlier. Intelligence suggested they were scheduled for execution before the ceasefire could save them. Elias led a six-man element tasked with extraction. They inserted by helicopter 12 kilometers from the target, humped through the desert in darkness, reached the compound perimeter at 0300. Everything went wrong within the first 5 minutes. Enemy reinforcements they had not expected. His team pinned behind a concrete barrier, taking fire from 3 positions. Radio crackling with abort orders from command. Mission compromised. Extract immediately. Elias did not extract. He found a drainage culvert on the east side of the compound. 18 inches of standing water, fouled with things he tried not to think about. 40 minutes of crawling through absolute darkness until he emerged inside the wire. 11 hostiles between him and the holding area. He neutralized each one without raising alarm. Knife were mostly silent, precise. The kind of violence that left no room for hesitation or mercy. The POWs were in terrible condition. Beatings had left some barely conscious. Malnutrition had weakened all of them. 3 cannot walk. Elias began carrying them out one at a time, back through the culvert, across 3 kilometers of hostile territory to where his team had established a secondary position. 7 trips, each one a gamble against discovery. Each one a race against the dawn that would expose him to every Iraqi soldier in the province. The British SAS Sergeant Collins kept telling him to leave, kept saying one man's life was not worth risking for another trip back into that hell. Elias made the trip anyway, and the next, and the next. He took shrapnel to the shoulder on the final push, wrapped it with a strip torn from his shirt, and kept moving. The extraction point had been compromised, so he called an audible, redirected to secondary LZ 4 kilometers north. When the helicopters finally lifted off with all 14 POWs and all 6 of his team members, Elias allowed himself to close his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. The Navy Cross citation was classified immediately. Operation Crimson Undertow ceased to exist in any official record. But among the teams, everyone knew. Spectre, the man who walked through walls. The Master Chief, who carried 14 men to safety through 3 kilometers of enemy territory on a night when command had ordered him to retreat. That was the legend. That was the man Kirkpatrick had just arrested for stolen valor. But the legend was not the whole truth. The legend did not include what came later. Afghanistan 2003. Another extraction gone wrong. Ronnie, Thibodeau, the swim buddy, the brother, the anchor, taking a sniper round to the throat that was meant for Elias. Bleeding out in 90 seconds while Elias pressed his hands against the wound and begged God or the universe or anyone listening to let him trade places. Ronnie's last words were about his wife Marie. Tell her I made it count. And then, with blood bubbling on his lips, the words that haunted Elias every night since. This is not on you, Eli. Never was. But it was. It had to be. Elias was the one who missed the sniper by half a second. Elias was the one who survived while his brother died. And no amount of medals or classified citations could change that fundamental truth. He carried the guilt for 15 years. Elena kept him together. Her laugh that could fill a room. Her hand on his chest at night when the dreams came. Her voice saying you are home. You are safe. I have you. She was the anchor after Ronnie died. When the cancer took her in 2021, it took everything else too. The medical bills consumed his savings. The house went next. The VA offered help, programs and counseling and housing assistance. He refused it all. Did not deserve it. Ronnie was dead. Elena was dead. What right did Elias Whitfield have to comfort when the people he loved most had been taken from him? 3 years on the streets now. Norfolk because the ships were here. Because the water was here. Because standing at that fence watching the Navy that had been his family for 26 years was the closest thing to peace he could find. And now he sat in a holding cell, arrested for the crime of being exactly who he was, waiting for a hearing that would determine whether his entire life had been a lie. The fluorescent light continued its endless hum. Somewhere beyond these walls, preparations continued for a ship commissioning ceremony. Admirals and politicians gathering to celebrate the launch of a new destroyer. None of them knew that in a few short hours, their ceremony would be interrupted by a ghost from operations that never existed, carrying scars from wars that were never officially fought. Lieutenant Commander Adrian Forsyth entered the hearing room like she owned every square inch of it, which, in the context of this particular proceeding, she effectively did. 34 years old with a Harvard Law degree and a fast-track career built on precision and ambition. She had never heard a shot fired in anger, never deployed beyond the safety of stateside legal offices. But she carried herself with the absolute certainty of someone who believed credentials and intelligence were sufficient substitutes for experience. She had prosecuted 3 stolen valor cases in the past year alone, each one a headline, each one a stepping stone. The photographs of her standing beside convicted frauds had appeared in Navy Times twice. Her commanding officer had mentioned her name in connection with an early promotion. Adrian Forsyth was going places, and the disheveled old man being escorted into the hearing room was simply the next rung on her ladder. The room itself was windowless and functional. A long conference table dominated the center, scarred from decades of use. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that seemed designed to induce headaches. An American flag hung limply in one corner beside the Navy flag, both of them faded from years of recycled air. A photograph of the current chief of naval operations watched from a wall with the empty authority of bureaucratic portraiture. Kirkpatrick stood at attention near the door, his posture rigid with professional satisfaction. He had made the arrest. His name was on the report. This was his win as much as it was Forsyth's. Petty Officer Second Class Yolanda Vance sat at a small desk near the wall, recording equipment arranged before her. 24 years old, she had joined the Navy to pay for college, following in the footsteps of a father who had served in the Marines and come home with demons he never learned to name. She was supposed to be neutral, administrative, invisible, but her eyes kept drifting to the old man in the plastic chair, seeing something in his hollow gaze that reminded her of her father on the bad nights. Elias sat with his hands folded in his lap. They had removed the handcuffs, but he still held himself with the careful stillness of a man accustomed to restraint. His clothes were the same layers of worn fabric he had been wearing for months. His boots, held together with duct tape and determination, left faint marks of dirt on the otherwise sterile floor. He looked exactly like what they believed him to be. A vagrant, a fraud, a sad old man playing dress-up with symbols he had not earned. Forsyth opened the thin file before her. Arrest report, identification card listing an address that no longer existed. Nothing else. No service records. No de 214. No documentation of any kind to support the claims this man had apparently made. She looked up at him with the expression of a predator who has already calculated the distance to her prey. Mr. Whitfield. She let the name hang in the air like an accusation. You were apprehended at the perimeter of Naval Station Norfolk, displaying what appears to be a Navy SEAL trident tattoo on your left forearm. Can you explain how you came to have this marking? Elias met her gaze without flinching. His voice was hoarse when he spoke, rough from days of silence, but steady. I earned it, ma'am. Bud/S Class 142. Coronado. 1982. Forsyth's smile was thin and cold. I see. And I suppose you have documentation to support this claim. A DD-214. Service records. Anything at all that might verify this rather extraordinary assertion. No, ma'am. Everything was lost when I lost my home. How convenient. She made a note on her tablet. The stylus moved with sharp, precise strokes. So you expect me to simply take your word that you were a Navy SEAL, based on nothing more than a tattoo that could have been purchased at any parlor in the country? I do not expect anything, ma'am. I am simply telling you the truth. Forsyth leaned back in her chair. Her eyes swept over him with undisguised contempt, cataloging every stain and tear and sign of degradation. The truth. Let me tell you what I see, Mr. Whitfield. I see a homeless man with a faded tattoo making claims he cannot substantiate. I see someone who has likely spent years trading on the valor of real servicemen for handouts and sympathy. I see a fraud. Elias said nothing. His expression did not change. He had faced interrogators far more skilled than this in rooms far less comfortable. He had been trained to resist techniques that would break most men in hours. A junior JAG officer with a Harvard degree and a chip on her shoulder was not going to rattle him. His silence seemed to irritate her. She began firing questions in rapid succession. Unit assignments, deployment locations, names of commanding officers. She was looking for inconsistencies, the places where invented stories always fell apart under scrutiny. But Elias's answers were not invented. They came with the automatic precision of lived experience. SEAL Team 4 from 1986 to 1993. Development Group from 1993 to 2008. Commanding officers whose names she did not recognize because their assignments were classified above her clearance level. Deployment locations that matched no official records because those deployments officially never occurred. She asked about operations. He gave her dates and coordinates that meant nothing to her, but would have meant everything to anyone with access to the files she could not see. Something flickered in her eyes, the tiniest crack in her certainty. But she pressed on, committed now to a path she could not abandon without admitting doubt. "Remove your shirt, Mr. Whitfield." The words fell into silence. Kirkpatrick shifted uncomfortably near the door. Vance stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Elias looked at Forsyth for a long moment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am, with respect, I would rather not. This is not a request, Mr. Whitfield. If you're who you claim to be, your body should tell that story. Scars, additional tattoos, evidence of the service you claim." She paused, letting her implications settle. "Unless, of course, there is nothing to show. Unless the tattoo on your arm is the full extent of your performance." Elias remained still. The room waited. Somewhere beyond the walls, the base continued its daily rhythms, sailors going about their duties unaware of the quiet confrontation taking place in this windowless room. Finally, slowly, he reached for the top button of his threadbare shirt. The room held its breath. The first button came free with a soft sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Then the second, then the third. Elias moved with deliberate slowness, not from reluctance, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. 3 layers of clothing came away, each one more worn than the last, fabrics that had been washed in gas station bathrooms and dried under highway overpasses. And then his torso was bare beneath the fluorescent lights. Forsyth's face changed. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, a crack spreading through the mask of contempt she had worn since entering the room. Kirkpatrick made a sound in his throat, something between a gasp and a grunt, his rigid posture softening into uncertainty. Vance stopped breathing entirely, her eyes fixed on what the old man's clothes had been hiding. His body was a testament written in scar tissue and ink. The shrapnel wounds came first, demanding attention through sheer brutality. Puckered craters across his left side, where hot metal had torn through flesh and lodged against bone. The scars were old, decades old, but they still carried the violence of their creation. A bullet graze ran along his ribs, a furrow of pale tissue where a round had come close enough to kill and missed by the width of a prayer. Surgical scars crossed his abdomen in patterns that spoke of field medicine performed without anesthesia, of desperate repairs made in places where proper hospitals existed only in memory. And then there were the tattoos. The trident on his forearm was echoed by an older, more elaborate version on his right shoulder. This was not the clean work of a stateside parlor. The ink had been laid down overseas, the lines slightly irregular in the way of military tattoos done in back rooms and bunkers. Faded now, the colors muted by time and sun, but unmistakably authentic to anyone who knew what to look for. On his ribs, coordinates were etched in precise numerals. 29.3117 degrees north. 47.4818 degrees east. Below them, a date rendered in military format. February 24th, 1991. Over his heart, 2 letters stood alone. RT. And beneath those letters, another date. March 12th, 2003. Forsyth recovered faster than the others, but something in her certainty had cracked. She pressed forward anyway, momentum carrying her past the first stirrings of doubt. These could be self-inflicted. Her voice had lost some of its edge. Tattoos can be copied from photographs. Coordinates can be researched. Scars can be obtained in any number of ways. Elias stood motionless, letting his body speak for itself. 61 years of life mapped across his skin. The road atlas of a man who had walked through fire and carried the burns ever since. Kirkpatrick shifted his weight near the door. He had seen enough combat footage, enough photographs of real operators, to recognize what he was looking at. The scars did not lie. The placement of the tattoos did not lie. Everything about this man's body told a story that could not be purchased or invented. But he had made the arrest. His name was on the paperwork. His career was attached to this case now, and backing down meant admitting he had been wrong. Forsyth pointed to the coordinates on his ribs. Explain these. If they mean what you seem to be implying, then explain them. Something shifted in Elias. His posture changed, spine straightening almost imperceptibly, shoulders settling into an alignment that spoke of decades of military bearing. When he spoke, his voice had transformed. No longer the hoarse whisper of a homeless man. This was the voice of a master chief delivering a briefing. 29.3117 degrees north. 47.4818 degrees east. Kuwait Province border, February 24th, 1991. Operation Crimson Undertow. The words fell into silence like stones into still water. We inserted by helicopter at 0247 local time. 12 kilometers from the target compound. 6-man element, myself as team lead. Primary objective was extraction of 14 coalition POWs confirmed held at the location. Intelligence indicated scheduled execution before ceasefire. Forsyth opened her mouth to interrupt. Kirkpatrick, without thinking, said quietly, "Let him finish, ma'am." She turned toward him, ready to reprimand his breach of protocol. But something in his face stopped her, something that looked almost like fear. Elias continued as though neither of them had spoken. We reached the perimeter at 0300. Enemy reinforcements we had not anticipated. My team was pinned within 5 minutes of initial contact. Command ordered abort. I did not abort. His eyes were distant now, seeing sand and darkness and muzzle flash instead of fluorescent lights and government furniture. Drainage culvert on the east side. 18 inches of standing water. 40 minutes to reach the interior. 11 hostiles between insertion point and holding area. I neutralized each one without raising alarm. Vance had forgotten she was supposed to be recording. Her hands lay motionless on the keyboard, tears forming in eyes that saw her father's face superimposed over the stranger's. The POWs were in critical condition. Beatings, malnutrition, psychological trauma. 3 were non-ambulatory. I began extraction one at a time. Through the culvert. 3 kilometers of hostile territory. 7 trips total. He paused. His hand moved unconsciously toward the coordinates on his ribs, fingers brushing the numbers as though they were braille. The British SAS Sergeant Collins told me to stop coming back. Said one man's life was not worth the risk. I made the trip anyway. And the next. And the one after that. Forsyth was gripping her stylus so hard her knuckles had gone white. I took shrapnel to the shoulder on the 7th extraction, wrapped it with my shirt, and continued movement. Primary LZ was compromised, redirected to secondary extraction 0.4 kilometers north. Helicopters lifted off at 0612 with all 14 POWs and all 6 members of my team. He looked at Forsyth directly. His eyes held no anger, no accusation, only the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying these memories alone for too long. Operation Crimson Undertow does not exist in any file you can access, ma'am. The citation for my Navy Cross is classified above your clearance level. You cannot verify any of what I have told you through standard channels." He paused, but I did not invent it. I lived it, and I have been living with it every day since. The silence that followed his words was absolute. The fluorescent lights continued their endless hum, but no one in the room seemed to hear them. Forsyth sat frozen behind the conference table, her stylus still clutched in white-knuckled fingers, her face a battlefield where certainty and doubt fought for territory. She should stop. Some part of her knew this with perfect clarity. The details he had provided were too specific, too precise, too laden with the weight of lived experience. No fraud she had ever prosecuted could recite coordinates and tactical movements with that kind of cold accuracy. No imposter could manufacture the scars that mapped his torso or the 1,000-yard stare that had crept into his eyes as he spoke. But Adrienne Forsyth had built her career on never backing down. She had filed reports. She had already begun mentally drafting the press release. To stop now would be to admit error, and error was not something her carefully constructed professional identity could accommodate. She set down her stylus and folded her hands on the table. The gesture was meant to project control. It projected desperation instead. "Anyone can memorize coordinates, Mr. Whitfield." Her voice had lost its edge of contempt but gained something harder. Defensiveness masquerading as skepticism. "Anyone can research military operations and construct an elaborate fiction. What you have described is impossible to verify, which makes it very convenient for your purposes." Elias said nothing. He stood bare-chested in the cold room, his body speaking truths that his words could not prove. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was beyond his control. Kirkpatrick cleared his throat near the door. His face had gone through several transformations in the past few minutes, moving from righteous satisfaction through confusion and into something that looked increasingly like shame. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "perhaps we should contact Naval Special Warfare Command. Request verification through official channels before proceeding." Forsyth turned on him with barely contained fury. "Noted, petty officer." And rejected. "I have prosecuted 3 stolen valor cases in the past year. I have seen every variation of this performance. The elaborate backstories, the convenient lack of documentation, the appeals to classified operations that conveniently cannot be confirmed. This man is clearly disturbed and has constructed an impressive fiction, but it remains a fiction." She turned back to Elias. Her eyes moved to the letters over his heart. RT. The 2 initials inked in simple black, unadorned by any military symbolism, personal in a way that the other tattoos were not. "And what about these?" She pointed. "Another convenient detail. Another unverifiable claim. Let me guess. A fallen comrade. A brother in arms. Someone whose death you will now describe in emotionally manipulative detail to garner sympathy." Elias's composure cracked for the first time. Just a fraction. A flicker of something raw and wounded passing across his face before he controlled it. His hand moved unconsciously toward his chest, where dog tags hung beneath his discarded shirts. "Ronnie Thibodeau," he said. His voice had changed again. Softer now, weighted with a grief that 3 years of homelessness had done nothing to diminish. "Petty officer first class. My swim buddy from BUD/S. My brother in everything that mattered." Forsyth leaned forward. "And where is this Ronnie Thibodeau now? Available to corroborate your claims." "He is dead." The words fell into the room like a physical weight. Vance had stopped pretending to record. Her hands were pressed flat against the desk, tears running freely down her cheeks. Her father had come home from the Marines with the same hollowed look in his eyes, had spoken of friends lost in the same broken voice, had carried the same invisible weight until it finally crushed him. Elias reached into the pile of discarded clothing and retrieved the dog tags that had been hidden against his chest. 2 sets, his own and another, older pair with edges worn smooth from decades of handling. March 12, 2003. Afghanistan. We were extracting a high-value asset when the situation deteriorated. RPG took out our rear vehicle. Ronnie and I went back for the wounded. He held up the older tags. The name Thibodeau was barely legible, the letters worn down by years of contact with skin and sweat and grief. Sniper round came from a position we had cleared twice. I missed him, half a second too slow on the scan. The round went past my ear and took Ronnie in the throat. His voice remained steady, but something in his eyes had shattered. He bled out in 90 seconds. I have advanced combat trauma training. I have kept men alive through wounds that should have killed them instantly, and I could not stop the bleeding. I held him in my arms and watched him die on a dirt road in a country most Americans cannot find on a map. Forsyth shifted in her seat. The room had become unbearably small. The story was too specific, too laden with sensory detail, too heavy with the particular weight of genuine memory. But she could not stop, would not stop. A touching narrative. Her voice came out weaker than she intended. But narratives are easy to construct. Dead men cannot contradict the stories told about them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Kirkpatrick actually flinched at her words. Vance made a small sound of protest that she quickly suppressed. Elias looked at Forsyth with something that might have been pity. His widow gave me these tags at the funeral. Marie Thibodeau. She said Ronnie would have wanted me to have them. I have worn them every day since. Not for sympathy, not for performance, because carrying them is the only way I know to keep him close. He paused. His eyes moved to the flags hanging limp in the corner of the room. You can prosecute me if you choose. You can recommend whatever charges you believe are justified. But you will not make me ashamed of these tags. And you will not make me pretend that the man who wore them did not matter. Forsyth opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in her carefully constructed career, she had nothing to say. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Forsyth stared at the old man standing shirtless before her, his body a canvas of violence and loss. And for the first time in her career, she felt the ground shifting beneath her certainty. But she had prosecuted 3 cases this year. She had built her reputation on being the one who did not flinch. She had already committed to this course in ways that could not be easily undone. She recovered, drew herself up in her chair, and reached for the armor of procedure. Regardless of the emotional nature of your testimony, Mr. Whitfield, the fact remains that you have provided no verifiable documentation. You claim classified operations. You claim awards that cannot be confirmed. You claim a service record that exists nowhere in accessible databases. From a legal standpoint, you have given me nothing but stories. Elias began putting his shirts back on, layer by layer, covering the scars and ink that had briefly testified on his behalf. When he was dressed again, he looked exactly as he had when they brought him in. A homeless man in worn clothing. Unremarkable. Invisible. I understand, ma'am. He said it without bitterness, without anger. Just the flat acceptance of a man who had stopped expecting the world to treat him fairly. Kirkpatrick spoke again from his position near the door. His voice was strained. Ma'am, I have to formally recommend that we pause these proceedings. What I have seen in this room suggests the possibility that we may be making a serious error. Forsyth's eyes flashed. Your recommendation is noted for the record, petty officer. It is also denied. I am the legal authority in this hearing, and I will determine when sufficient evidence has been presented. She turned back to Elias, stood from her chair, and walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of him. Close enough to smell the streets on his clothing. Close enough to see the fine tremor in his hands that he could not quite control. The dog tags, she said. The ones you claim belong to your fallen comrade. I am confiscating them as evidence. She reached for them. What happened next occurred in less than a second. Elias's hand moved with a speed that should have been impossible for a 61-year-old homeless man. Not violent, not aggressive, simply there. His fingers closed around her wrist with precise pressure, stopping her reach without causing pain. No, ma'am. Forsyth froze. Her eyes went wide. In her entire career, no one had ever physically interfered with her in a proceeding. Kirkpatrick's hand moved toward his sidearm, but stopped when he saw that Elias was not attacking, just blocking. Elias released her wrist and stepped back. His breathing had not changed. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes had shifted. a door opening onto a room that contained things she could not imagine. You can charge me with whatever you believe is appropriate. You can fine me. You can sentence me. You can do whatever the law allows. But you will not take these tags from me. Not while I am breathing. Forsyth rubbed her wrist. There was no mark. He had applied exactly enough pressure to stop her, and not 1 ounce more. The precision of it frightened her more than violence would have. You just assaulted a naval officer, she said. Her voice shook slightly despite her efforts to control it. I stopped you from taking something that does not belong to you. Elias's voice was quiet, but carried an edge of steel that had been absent before. These tags are not evidence. They're not props. They're the last physical connection I have to a man who died in my arms. A man who took a bullet meant for me. A man whose last words were telling me not to blame myself for something I will never stop blaming myself for. He looked at her with eyes that had seen things she could not comprehend. I have been beaten. I have been stabbed. I have been shot. I have watched friends die in countries whose names are still classified. I have carried men through enemy fire and held them while they bled out. I have done things that wake me up at night and things that I will never speak of to anyone. I have given everything I had to this country, and I have been forgotten by the same systems that sent me to war. The room had become a vacuum. No sound, no movement, only his voice filling the space. And now I stand in a room being called a liar by someone who has never fired a weapon outside of a qualification range. Being told that my service is a performance. Being threatened with charges for carrying the dog tags of my dead brother. He shook his head slowly. I have accepted many things, ma'am. I have accepted homelessness. I have accepted hunger. I have accepted being invisible to a world that no longer has any use for me. But I will not accept this. You can take my freedom. You cannot take Ronnie. Vance was openly weeping now, her hands pressed over her mouth to muffle the sounds. Kirkpatrick stood rigid at the door, his face a mask of barely contained anguish. He had made the arrest. He had called this man a fraud, and now he was watching something break open that he did not know how to contain. Forsyth took a step back, then another, her hand still resting on her wrist where Elias had stopped her. She should call security. She should have him restrained for what he had just done. But she found that her voice would not come. Her certainty had cracked, and through the fissures something cold was seeping in. Outside the hearing room, footsteps approached. Voices could be heard through the thin walls. The sounds of a naval base continuing its daily operations, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding within. But one set of footsteps slowed as it passed, stopped, and a voice that carried the weight of command spoke a single word that cut through the silence. Spectre. The door handle turned. Vice Admiral Chester Beaumont Hollins III stood in the doorway, with 3 stars gleaming on his collar and 40 years of naval special warfare written across his weathered face. He was 67 years old, broad-shouldered despite his age, with gray hair cropped close to his skull and eyes that had seen the same darkness Elias carried. Behind him, a young lieutenant commander aide stood frozen in confusion, unsure why the admiral had stopped mid-stride to push open the door of a security hearing room. Hollins did not look at Forsyth, did not acknowledge Kirkpatrick or Vance. His eyes were fixed on the old man in the worn clothing, seeing past the grime and the years to something that existed in memory alone. Eli, he said softly, Elias Cormac Whitfield. The sound of his full name spoken in that voice did something to Elias that nothing else had managed. His composure, maintained through accusations and humiliation and the threat of losing Ronnie's tags, finally cracked. His eyes went glassy with recognition and something that might have been grief. Admiral Hollins. The two men looked at each other across the sterile government room. Decades collapsed between them. Hollins was seeing a young Master Chief with blood on his hands and shrapnel in his shoulder, climbing off a helicopter after doing the impossible. Elias was seeing the lieutenant commander who had been waiting at the extraction point, who had watched him carry 14 men to safety, who had written the recommendation that resulted in a classified Navy Cross. Forsyth found her voice. Admiral Hollins, sir, this is a security hearing. The detainee was arrested for suspected stolen valor violations. If you require this room for another purpose, we can relocate the proceedings. Hollins turned to look at her. The weight of 3 stars and 4 decades of command settled on her like a physical force. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, more dangerous than if he had shouted. I heard coordinates through the window, Lieutenant Commander. Coordinates I have not thought about in 33 years. Coordinates I helped write the classified citation for. Forsyth's face went pale. Sir, this man claims to be a Navy SEAL. He has provided no documentation. He was arrested at the perimeter fence, displaying what appeared to be fraudulent insignia. Hollins stepped fully into the room. His aide remained in the doorway, sensing that something was happening that exceeded his clearance level to understand. Do you know what Operation Crimson Undertow was, Lieutenant Commander? No, sir. It does not appear in any database I can access. That is because it is classified above your clearance level. Above most clearance levels. Hollins moved closer to Elias, studying the man he had last seen over 2 decades ago. The operation was a POW extraction during the final days of the Gulf War. 14 coalition prisonniers. 3 kilometers of hostile territory. One man went in alone when his team was pinned down and carried every single prisoner to safety. He stopped directly in front of Elias, close enough to see the shape of dog tags beneath his worn shirts. I was there, Eli. I was extraction commander. I was the one who pulled you out of that LZ after you made 7 trips that nobody thought were possible. I was the one who watched you refuse medical evacuation until every man was accounted for. Forsyth gripped the edge of the conference table. The room was tilting around her. Everything she had believed about this case, every assumption and judgment, crumbling in real time. Hollins reached out and touched Elias on the shoulder. The gesture was simple, but carried the weight of shared history that no words could convey. I wrote your Navy Cross recommendation myself, sat in a tent in Kuwait City, and tried to find words for what you had done. The classification came later when the operation details became politically sensitive. But I remember every word I wrote. I remember thinking that no one would believe it if they had not been there to see it. Elias's voice came out rough, broken in places. It was a long time ago, Admiral. Not so long that I would forget. Hollins turned back to Forsyth. His expression had hardened into something that made her shrink back involuntarily. Lieutenant Commander, do you understand who you have been interrogating? She could not speak. Her throat had closed around words that refused to form. This is Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Whitfield, retired. Call sign Spectre. 26 years of service to the United States Navy. Recipient of the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, and 2 Purple Hearts. His Navy Cross citation is classified because the operation it describes officially never happened. But I was there. I watched him do the impossible, and I watched the Navy fail him. The last words hung in the air like an accusation. Kirkpatrick had tears streaming down his face. He had made the arrest. He had called this man a fraud. He had looked at the worn clothes and the faded tattoo and seen exactly what he was trained to see. A deception. A performance. Not a warrior who had bled for the very base where he now stood accused. Hollins was not finished. We'll look for you, Eli. After Elena died, after you disappeared, the teams looked for you. The Brotherhood does not forget its own. But you did not want to be found. Elias shook his head slowly. I did not deserve to be found, Admiral. That is not your call to make. Hollins's voice softened. Ronnie Thibodeau would not have wanted this for you. Elena would not have wanted this. The men you saved in Kuwait did not survive so that you could punish yourself for the rest of your life. At the sound of Ronnie's name, something shifted in Elias's face. The armor he had worn for 3 years, the acceptance of invisibility and suffering, showed its first true cracks. Hollins turned back to Forsyth. His voice returned to the cold precision of command. This hearing is over. Whatever charges you are contemplating are dismissed. And you and I will be having a conversation about the judgment that led to a Navy Cross recipient being treated like a criminal in a room without windows. Forsyth opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Her career was not ending. It was already over. She simply had not processed the information yet. Beyond the walls of the hearing room, The base continued its preparations for the commissioning ceremony. But the ceremony would have to wait. Something more important had just begun. Word traveled through Naval Station Norfolk with the speed of electricity through copper wire. Within minutes of Admiral Hollins entering the hearing room, the ripples had begun spreading outward. A three-star had abandoned preparations for the commissioning ceremony. Something was happening in the security building. Rumors multiplied and mutated as they passed from sailor to sailor, growing more elaborate with each telling. By the time Hollins emerged from the room with Elias at his side, a small crowd had gathered in the corridor. Officers and enlisted personnel who had heard fragments of what was happening and could not resist the pull of witnessing something extraordinary. They parted as Hollins walked through, their eyes moving from the Admiral's stars to the old man in worn clothing who walked beside him. Hollins had made calls. His aide, still struggling to process what he had witnessed, was relaying instructions to Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. Classification barriers were being lifted for verification purposes. Files that had been sealed for decades were being pulled and reviewed. By end of day, everyone who needed to know would know. But Elias was not processing any of it. He walked through the corridor in a daze, his hands still pressed against his chest where Ronnie's dog tags rested. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright. The faces around him blurred into an undifferentiated mass. He had spent 3 years becoming invisible, and now he was being seen in ways he had never wanted. Hollins guided him to a small conference room away from the gathering crowd, closed the door, pulled out a chair, and gestured for Elias to sit. Eli. His voice was gentle now, the command presence set aside in favor of something older. Something human. When did you last eat? Elias had to think about it. The days had a tendency to blend together when survival became routine. Yesterday, maybe. Shelter meal. Soup and bread. Hollins spoke quietly to his aide, who nodded and disappeared. Then he sat down across from Elias, studying the face of a man he had once known as a legend. Tell me what happened. After Elena. The words were an invitation, not a command. Elias could refuse, could stay silent as he had stayed silent for 3 years. But something about being in this room with a man who remembered who he used to be broke through the walls he had constructed. The cancer came fast, he said. His voice was hollow, distant. 6 months from diagnosis to the end. The treatments cost everything. Insurance covered some of it. Not enough. I sold the house to pay what was left. By the time she was gone, there was nothing. Hollins listened without interrupting. His face betrayed nothing but attention. The VA offered help. Counseling. Housing assistance. I refused it. Elias's hands tightened on his knees. I did not deserve it. Ronnie was dead because I missed a shot. Elena was dead because I could not protect her from something no amount of training could fight. What right did I have to comfort when everyone I loved was gone? That is survivor's guilt talking, not truth. Elias shook his head. It felt like truth. Still feels like truth. 3 years on the streets, and I still wake up, sometimes thinking I should not be here. That my continued existence is some kind of cosmic error. Hollins leaned forward. His eyes held a weight that matched Elias's own. I lost men too, Eli. Good men. Men who died because of decisions I made. You think I do not carry that? You think any of us who served at that level walk away clean? It is different. It is not different. Hollins's voice sharpened. It is the same wound that every operator carries. The same impossible math of who lives and who dies. You did not kill Ronnie. A sniper killed Ronnie. War killed Ronnie. And you have been punishing yourself for something that was never your fault. Elias looked away. Through the small window in the door, he could see people still gathered in the corridor. Watching. Waiting. The invisible man made suddenly, uncomfortably visible. The aide returned with food. A sandwich. Coffee. Simple things that felt impossibly extravagant after years of shelter meals and dumpster finds. Elias looked at the food like it might bite him. Eat, Hollins said. That is an order, Master Chief. The ranks startled Elias. He had not been called by his rate in 3 years. The word reached something deep in his muscle memory, triggering automatic responses that decades of training had carved into his nervous system. He picked up a sandwich, took a bite. The bread was fresh. The coffee was hot. Small mercies that brought tears to his eyes. There is something else you need to know, Hollins said as Elias ate. Marie Thibodeau, Ronnie's widow. She is here in Norfolk. Works at the VA hospital. Elias stopped chewing. His face went pale. She has been looking for you, Eli. For 3 years. Ever since you disappeared. She never blamed you for Ronnie's death. She wanted you to know that. I cannot see her. The words came out strangled. I cannot look at her and explain why her husband is dead and I am not. That is exactly why you need to see her. Hollins reached across the table and gripped Elias's forearm. The touch was firm, grounding. Ronnie's last letter home. Marie showed it to me years ago. He wrote about you. About how you were the best operator he ever served with. About how if anything happened to him, it was not your fault. He knew the risks. He accepted them, and he loved you like a brother. Elias's hands trembled. The sandwich fell back to the plate. You have been carrying this alone for too long. Hollins's voice softened. Let us help you carry it. That is what brothers do. Through the window, more people had gathered. Word was spreading further now. Phones were out. Photographs being taken. The story was escaping the confines of the base, reaching toward a world that would soon know the name Elias Whitfield. But in this small room, there was only an old man learning that he had not been forgotten, that the brotherhood he had served still remembered him, that the door he had closed behind himself 3 years ago had never truly been locked. The commissioning ceremony for the USS Constance Hargrove proceeded 3 hours behind schedule. The Secretary of the Navy had been informed of the delay and its cause. She had ordered Admiral Hollins to take whatever time was necessary. Some things mattered more than schedules. In the hearing room, Forsyth sat alone. The door was closed, but not locked. She could leave at any time. She remained seated because she did not know where else to go. Her stylus lay on the table in front of her. Her tablet displayed the half-written recommendation that would never be filed. 3 stolen valor prosecutions this year. Headlines in Navy Times. A career built on certainty and precision. All of it crumbling around her like a sandcastle meeting the tide. She had tried to confiscate the dog tags of a fallen SEAL from the hands of a Navy Cross recipient. She had called a 26-year veteran a fraud. She had looked at scars earned in service to her country and dismissed them as props. The magnitude of her error was still sinking in when the door opened. Kirkpatrick stepped inside. His eyes were red. His posture had lost the rigid confidence that had defined him since the arrest. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out and was still learning to move without the parts of himself that were missing. Mom. His voice was rough. Admiral Hollins wants to see you in conference room B. Forsyth nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. She gathered her tablet and stylus with hands that trembled slightly and walked past Kirkpatrick without meeting his eyes. The corridor was still crowded. Faces turned toward her as she passed. Some curious, some accusatory, some simply watching to see what would happen next. She kept her gaze forward and her spine straight, clinging to the last remnants of dignity she could muster. Conference room B was larger than the hearing room. A long table dominated the space, surrounded by chairs that had held admirals and captains and defense contractors. Now it held only Hollins, seated at the head, and 2 rear admirals who had arrived in the past hour. The base commander stood near the window, his face unreadable. Forsyth stopped at the threshold. Hollins gestured to a chair. Sit down, Lieutenant Commander. She sat. The chair felt too large. The room felt too bright. Everything felt like a fever dream from which she could not wake. Hollins studied her for a long moment before speaking. His voice was measured, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts. I have reviewed the recording of your hearing with Master Chief Whitfield. Petty Officer Vance was thorough in her documentation. Forsyth's stomach dropped. She had forgotten about Vance, forgotten about the recording equipment that had captured every word, every accusation, every moment of her certainty crashing against the truth. I want to be clear about what I observed, Hollins continued. I observed a decorated combat veteran being treated with contempt by an officer who had never deployed. I observed demands that he remove his clothing for inspection. I observed an attempt to confiscate the dog tags of a fallen service member. I observed mockery of genuine sacrifice by someone whose understanding of military service appears to be entirely theoretical. Each word landed like a hammer blow. Forsyth gripped the arms of her chair, fighting the urge to defend herself. There was no defense. She knew that now. "What I want to understand," Hollins said, leaning forward, "is how this happened. How a JAG officer entrusted with upholding justice could look at a man with those scars, hear those details, and conclude he was lying." Forsyth forced herself to speak. Her voice came out thin, strangled. "He had no documentation, sir. No de 214. Nothing I could verify through standard channels. My training, my experience with previous cases, suggested that unverifiable claims typically indicate fraud." "Your training." Hollins's tone sharpened. "Your training should have included the understanding that some operations are classified, that some service records are not accessible through standard channels, that the absence of documentation is not proof of deception. Yes, sir. Your training should have taught you to recognize the physical evidence of genuine service. The scars, the tattoos, the bearing, the specific operational knowledge that cannot be researched online." Forsyth said nothing. There was nothing to say. "But most importantly," Hollins continued, "your training should have instilled a basic respect for the possibility that the person in front of you might be telling the truth. You approached Master Chief Whitfield with the assumption that he was guilty. You treated him with contempt before the first question was asked. You saw what you expected to see, and you refused to see anything else." The base commander spoke for the first time. His voice was flat. "The video is already spreading, Lieutenant Commander. Petty Officer Vance uploaded it to her personal account 2 hours ago. Last I checked, it had 400,000 views and was climbing." Forsyth closed her eyes. The career she had built was not ending. It was detonating. "I'm not going to tell you what happens next," Hollins said. "That will be determined by people above my pay grade. But I will tell you this. Master Chief Whitfield spent 3 years on the streets because he believed he did not deserve help. He was wrong about that. But you, Lieutenant Commander, looked at a man who gave everything for this country and decided he was worthless based on the clothes he was wearing." He stood. The 2 rear admirals and the base commander moved toward the door. "I hope you spent some time thinking about what that says about you. And I hope whatever comes next teaches you something that your training clearly failed to impart." They left. Forsyth sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by empty chairs, as the sound of their footsteps faded down the corridor. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set over Norfolk. The ships in the harbor caught the light, their gray hulls turning gold. Somewhere out there, the story of what had happened was spreading, and Adrian Forsyth was left to contemplate the ruins of everything she thought she knew. The video reached 10 million views by midnight. Petty Officer Vance had uploaded it with a simple caption: "This happened today. Watch until the end." The footage was raw and unedited, captured from her position at the recording desk. Every word audible, every moment preserved. Forsyth's contempt, Elias's quiet dignity, the revelation of his scars, the recitation of coordinates that meant nothing to most viewers but carried the weight of history. And then Hollins walking through that door, speaking a single word that changed everything. Spectre. The internet did what the internet does. Within hours, researchers and military historians had identified Operation Crimson Undertow through fragments of declassified documents and veteran testimonies. The 14 POWs who had been rescued, now middle-aged men scattered across 3 countries, began reaching out through social media. One of them, the British SAS Sergeant Collins, recorded a video from his home in Edinburgh confirming every detail of what Elias had described. "He carried me on his back for 3 kilometers, Collins said, his voice breaking. "I told him to leave me. I told him I was not worth dying for. He made 3 more trips after that. The man is a bloody legend, and I have spent 30 years wondering what happened to him." The hashtag Justice for Spectre began trending at 2 in the morning. By dawn, it had been joined by others. Navy Cross Hero, Hidden Warrior, Never Forgotten. The story spread from military forums to mainstream news, from local affiliates to national networks. Journalists scrambled to piece together the life of a man who had been invisible for 3 years. Politicians issued statements. The Secretary of the Navy called it a failure of the systems meant to protect those who serve. Two senators demanded an investigation into how a decorated veteran could fall through every safety net designed to catch him. Veterans organizations mobilized, their spokespeople appearing on morning shows to discuss the epidemic of homelessness among those who had served. Through all of it, Elias remained in a small room on the naval base, largely unaware of the firestorm raging beyond its walls. Hollins had arranged for a cot to be brought in, clean clothes that roughly fit, a shower in the officers' facilities. Basic kindnesses that felt like miracles after 3 years of concrete and charity. Elias slept for 14 hours straight, the deepest sleep he had managed since Elena died. He woke to find Chief Warrant Officer Declan Murtaugh sitting in a chair by the door. Murtaugh was 58 years old, retired SWCC, with the weathered look of a man who had spent decades operating small boats in conditions no sane person would volunteer for. He ran a veteran reintegration house called the Quarterdeck, a converted warehouse near the Norfolk waterfront that offered beds and meals and community to those struggling to find their way back. Hollins called me, Murtaugh said when Elias stirred. We served together, back in the day. Different communities, but same waters. He said you might need someone who understands. Elias sat up slowly. His body ached in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury. The weight of the previous day, the exposure after years of hiding, pressed down on him like a physical force. I do not need anything, he said. The words came automatically, the reflex of a man who had trained himself to expect nothing. Murtaugh nodded, as if he had expected this response. That's what they all say. Every operator who comes through my door says the same thing. I am fine. I do not need help. I can handle it on my own. He leaned forward. You know what I tell them? I tell them that asking for help is not weakness. It is the hardest thing any of us ever learn to do. Elias looked away. Through a small window, he could see the harbor. Ships at anchor. The same view he had been watching through a chain-link fence for months. I lost my brother, Murtaugh continued. His voice softened. Not in combat. After. He came home from 3 deployments in one piece, and the war followed him anyway. Took him 4 years to lose the fight. I found him in his garage with a note that said he was sorry for not being strong enough. The words hung in the air. Elias did not speak. I started the quarterdeck because I cannot save him. But maybe I could save someone else. Maybe I could build a place where operators could come and not have to explain themselves. Where they could be understood without having to translate their experiences for people who would never comprehend them. Murtaugh stood and walked to the window. Stood beside Elias, looking out at the same harbor. I'm not here to save you, Eli. You do not need saving. You survived things that would have broken most men. But surviving is not the same as living. And you have spent 3 years doing one while forgetting how to do the other. Elias's hands found the dog tags beneath his fresh shirt. Ronnie's tags. The metal was warm from his skin. I do not know how to stop carrying it, he said quietly. The guilt, the weight. I do not know how to set it down. You do not set it down. Murtaugh's voice was gentle. You learn to carry it differently. You learn that the weight does not have to crush you, that you can walk upright even with everything you're holding. He turned to face Elias directly. The quarterdeck has a bed with your name on it. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, no pressure. You show up when you are ready. You stay as long as you need. And when we want to talk, we talk. When you do not, we sit in silence together. That is the only rule. We do not leave each other alone. Elias looked at this stranger who understood him better than anyone had in 3 years. The offer was simple. The implications were enormous. To accept help meant accepting that he deserved it. And that was a bridge he did not know how to cross. Murtaugh seemed to read his thoughts. Nobody is ready, Eli. Nobody walks through my door feeling like they have earned the right to be there. But the door stays open anyway. And when you are ready, you take one step, then another. That is how it works. One step at a time. He placed a card on the windowsill. An address. A phone number. Nothing else. The door stays open, he repeated. And then he was gone, leaving Elias alone with the harbor view and a choice he was not yet ready to make. Marie Thibodeau Kendrick arrived at the naval base 3 days after the video went viral. She had seen it the night Vance uploaded it, had watched it 17 times in a row, had wept until there were no tears left. Then she had called Admiral Hollins, a man she had not spoken to in 15 years, and asked him where Elias was. She was 54 now. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. She had remarried 8 years after Ronnie's death, to a good man named Curtis who understood that part of her heart would always belong to the boy from Louisiana who had made her laugh until her sides hurt. But she had never stopped thinking about Elias. Never stopped wondering what had happened to the man who had held her husband as he died. Hollins met her at the gate and escorted her to the small room where Elias had been staying. He had refused to leave the base, had refused the offers of hotels and housing that had flooded in after the story broke. He was not ready for the world yet. The room with its cot and its harbor view was as much as he could handle. "She is here," Hollins said through the door. "Marie, she wants to see you." Elias sat on the edge of the cot, his hands clasped between his knees. He had known this moment would come, had dreaded it since Hollins first mentioned her name. The idea of looking into the eyes of Ronnie's widow and seeing the accusation he was certain lived there was more terrifying than any operation he had ever run. "I cannot," he said. The door opened anyway. Marie stepped inside. Hollins closed the door behind her, leaving them alone. She looked at him for a long moment, taking in the clean clothes that did not quite fit, the gray beard that had been trimmed but not shaved, the hollow cheeks and haunted eyes of a man who had been running from himself for 3 years. "Eli," she said softly. The sound of his name in her voice broke something loose. He had heard Ronnie say that name 1,000 times. The same Louisiana accent, the same warmth beneath the syllables. He could not look at her, could not bear the weight of what he owed her. Marie crossed the room and sat beside him on the cot, close enough to touch. She did not touch him. "Not yet. I have been looking for you," she said, "ever since Elena's funeral. I tried to find you. We all tried. The teams, the families, everyone who ever served with you. You disappeared like smoke. I cannot stay." His voice was barely audible. "I cannot look at anyone who remembered him, who remembered what I failed to do." Marie was quiet for a moment. Then she reached in her purse and pulled out an envelope. The paper was worn, the edges soft from years of handling. She unfolded the letter inside with the care of someone handling sacred text. "This is the last letter Ronnie sent me. I got it 2 weeks after the notification team came to my door." She held it where he could see Ronnie's handwriting, messy and slanted, the scrawl of a man who had never been comfortable with pens. "I have read it so many times I have it memorized. But there's a part one want you to hear." Elias closed his eyes. His hands trembled. Marie began to read. "If anything happens to me, I need you to know it is not Eli's fault. Whatever the circumstances, however it goes down, I know that man will blame himself. That is who he is. He takes responsibility for things that are not his to carry. So if you ever see him again, Marie, tell him I said to stop. Tell him to live. Tell him his job is not to die for me. His job is to live for both of us." Her voice cracked on the last words. She folded the letter and returned it to the envelope with reverent hands. Elias could not speak, could not breathe. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of believing he had failed the man he loved like a brother, and Ronnie had known. Had written these words before the bullet ever found him. Had absolved Elias of a sin he had not yet committed. He knew, Marie said. She reached out and took Elias's hand. The first human touch he had accepted in 3 years. He knew you would carry this. He knew it would break you. And he wanted me to find you and tell you to stop. The tears came then. Elias had not wept since Elena's funeral. Had locked that part of himself away in the same place he had locked everything else that made him human. But Marie's hand in his, Ronnie's words echoing in the small room, the accumulated weight of 3 years of running, it was too much. The dam broke. Marie held him as he sobbed, held him the way she would have held a brother, the way Ronnie would have held him if their positions had been reversed. She did not tell him it was okay. It was not okay. Nothing about any of it was okay. But she held him anyway, and that was enough. When the storm passed, when his breathing steadied and the tears slowed, she spoke again. "I remarried," she said. "His name is Curtis. He is a good man. He knows about Ronnie, knows about you, knows about all of it. And he told me something once that I want you to hear. Elias looked at her, his eyes red, his face wet. He said that loving someone who died does not mean you stop living. It means you carry them with you into the life they cannot have. You live for both of you. She squeezed his hand. That is what Ronnie wanted, Eli. Not this. Never this. Elias looked down at their joined hands. Her fingers were warm, alive. Ronnie's ring no longer on her finger, but Ronnie's love still in her heart. I do not know how, he whispered. I have been lost for so long. I do not know the way back. Marie smiled through her own tears. That is okay, she said. We will help you find it. The door is open. All you have to do is walk through. 6 months later, Elias Whitfield stood at a podium in the Norfolk Veterans Memorial Auditorium. The room held 300 people, veterans from every branch and era, families who had lost someone to war or to the invisible wounds that followed warriors home, journalists who had tracked his story from that first viral video to this moment. And in the front row, Marie Thibodeau Kendrick sat beside her husband Curtis, tears already forming in her eyes. Elias wore a suit for the first time in years. It fit properly now. 6 months of regular meals and medical care had restored some of the weight he had lost on the streets. His beard was trimmed close. His posture was straight. He looked like a man who had remembered who he was. The quarterdeck had saved him. Not immediately. Not easily. The first 2 weeks, he had barely spoken. Had sat in the back of group sessions and listened to other veterans share their stories without offering his own. Murtaugh had not pushed, had simply been present day after day, proving through consistency that the door really would stay open. On the 15th day, Elias spoke for the first time. My name is Elias. Call sign was Spectre, and I lost my best friend because I missed a shot. It was not much, but it was a beginning. The months that followed were not linear. There were setbacks, nights when the dreams came so hard he woke up screaming. Days when the guilt crashed over him like waves, and he could not get out of bed. But there were also mornings when the sunrise over the harbor felt like something other than mockery. Afternoons when laughter came unexpectedly and did not immediately curdle into shame. Therapy helped. Real therapy with a counselor who specialized in combat trauma and understood that some wounds could not be healed, only managed. The VA had assigned him a caseworker who cut through the bureaucratic tangles and ensured he received the benefits he had earned decades ago. His Navy Cross, long buried in classified files, was formally acknowledged in a private ceremony at Naval Special Warfare Command. Admiral Hollins pinned the medal to his chest himself. Lieutenant Commander Forsyth resigned from the Navy 2 months after the incident. The investigation had found no criminal wrongdoing, but had documented a pattern of professional misconduct that made continued service untenable. In her resignation letter, which was leaked to the press, she wrote that she hoped to spend the rest of her career earning the right to apologize for what she had done. Last Elias heard, she had enrolled in a veteran advocacy program and was working with homeless service members in San Diego. Kirkpatrick had requested transfer to the Fleet and Family Support Center. He processed benefits claims now, helping veterans navigate the systems that had failed so many of them. He had written Elias a letter of apology that ran 6 pages. Elias had written back a single paragraph telling him that forgiveness was already given, that good men make mistakes, and that what matters is what you do after. Petty Officer Vance had been promoted. The video she uploaded, viewed now by over 47 million people, had sparked a national conversation about how the country treated its veterans. Congressional hearings were held. Funding was allocated. Programs were expanded. None of it would have happened without a 24-year-old administrative specialist who saw something wrong and refused to let it stay hidden. Now, Elias stood at the podium, looking out at faces that looked back at him with something he had not seen directed at himself in years. Respect, gratitude, hope. He cleared his throat and began to speak. I was you, he said. His voice carried clearly through the auditorium. I lived under an overpass for 3 years. I ate from dumpsters and shelter kitchens. I convinced myself that I did not deserve help because the people I loved were gone and I was still here. He paused. Let the words settle. I was wrong. The room was silent, attentive, hungry for what came next. Ronnie Thibodeau did not die, so I could waste myself on guilt. Elena did not love me, so I could throw that love away. The men I carried out of that compound in Kuwait did not survive, so I could surrender to my own demons. His hand moved to his chest. Beneath the suit jacket, Ronnie's dog tags still rested against his heart. They would always rest there. Surviving is not betraying the dead. Surviving is honoring them. Living is honoring them. Carrying their memory forward into a world they cannot see, that is honoring them. And asking for help when you need it, letting others carry what you cannot carry alone, that is not weakness. That is strength. That is the hardest thing any of us ever learn to do. He looked at Marie in the front row. She was smiling through her tears. Curtis had his arm around her shoulders. Someone told me once that the door stays open, that when you are ready, you take one step, then another. That is how it works. One step at a time. He straightened his spine, the Master Chief emerging from the broken man. I am here to tell you that the door is open. For every one of you. For every veteran sleeping under a bridge tonight. For every operator who thinks the guilt will never lift. For every family member who does not know how to help. The door is open, and there are hands reaching through it, ready to pull you in from the cold. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching. Elias stepped back from the podium. The applause began slowly and built until it filled the auditorium like thunder. He did not bow, did not wave, simply stood there, letting the sound wash over him, accepting something he had refused to accept for 3 years. He was not alone. He had never been alone. And the road ahead, however long and difficult, would not be walked in darkness. That night, he returned to the Norfolk Veterans Memorial, found the bench where he had sat so many mornings talking to ghosts, took out Ronnie's dog tags, and held them in the moonlight. Still here, brother, he whispered, still trying, finally ready to live for both of us. The harbor lights reflected on the water. Somewhere, a ship's horn sounded, and Elias Whitfield, call sign Spectre, began the longest mission of his life. Coming home.